From the Illinois State Capitol Rotunda, Capitol Bureau Chief Mark Maxwell is asking the tough questions. This is Capitol Connection.
Welcome to Capitol Connection. I'm Mark Maxwell, reporting from the Illinois State House on this Sunday, September 13. Speaker Madigan is now officially charged. No, not by federal or state prosecutors, but by his own peers. House Republican Minority Leader Jim Durkin officially filing a charge against Speaker Madigan, accusing him of conduct unbecoming a state legislator and a breach of public trust. To do that, he points to allegations made against ComEd in a federal deferred prosecution agreement. The first Special Investigative Committee held its hearing on this week, Thursday, to start the process to try and determine whether or not the state might discipline or even possibly expel Speaker Madigan, the most powerful politician in the state and the longest-standing State House Speaker in American history.
We're going to contact the U.S. Attorney's Office quickly.
Committee Chairman Chris Welch quickly dismissed the first Special Investigative Committee meeting without setting a date for the next one.
This committee must avoid taking any action that can be an interference with an ongoing federal investigation.
Welch plans to ask U.S. Attorney John Lausch for his blessing to continue.
And this is it's not a legal proceeding. It is a political proceeding. But we also have to be respectful of people's rights. And so what we have to do here is make sure with the U.S. Attorney's Office that we're clear on what the guidance is here and go from there.
Republicans clamoring for a chance to grill Speaker Madigan in person.
The Speaker should come forward.
Said their investigation is different than the criminal corruption case.
Representative Madigan engaged in conduct which is unbecoming to a legislator or which constitutes a breach of public trust.
You're saying crimes. What crimes?
The crimes that are described in the deferred prosecution agreement are a bribery scheme, an extortion scheme, a conspiracy to violate state and federal law, among other misconduct. But that is not for this body to decide. This body is to decide the charge of whether or not the Speaker has acted in a manner unbecoming to a representative.
Welch said he won't take sides.
The integrity of the committee requires an unbiased investigation and due process to the named member.
But will he order the Speaker to take the witness stand?
Do you see it as your duty to investigate, to dig, to find new information that perhaps isn't already in the public domain?
I don't think it's the job of the Illinois House of Representatives to do criminal investigation. That's what the U.S. Attorney is doing.
Don't you have the power to compel him to testify?
We have let the Speaker know that he has a right to be a part of this entire process.
Do you want to see him testify?
I'm going to reach out to the U.S. Attorney's Office and go from there.
What specifically do you need to hear from the Speaker, and should he testify before these hearings?
Well, if you read the deferred prosecution agreement, and if you've read things that have come out of the U.S. Attorney's Office, what you would say to yourself, I think anybody, and we've all had the ability, it's all public information, anybody would say to themselves is, there's so much more here that we need to get answers to. And you don't exactly know what questions to ask because there isn't quite enough in those indictment documents to tell you what avenue the U.S. Attorney is heading down. There are implications, but no explicit information that would give you the answers to the questions that I think most people would ask. But I don't know what those questions will be in total. What I can tell you is that we need to hear much more, and I've encouraged people to ask those questions, and I have said that it is vitally important that the Speaker speak up and tell us what exactly is being implied in those documents. And until we hear that, it's very hard to make a judgment. What I know is that it's dissatisfying to hear simply the implications and without the rest of the information.
Do I hear you correctly? Are you encouraging Democrats like Chairman Welch on this committee to use this panel to dig in, to investigate, to use subpoena power if they must?
I'm saying something slightly different, but certainly it is true that the Speaker needs to step up and answer these questions. Really, there's almost nobody else that could. And so that's what I'm saying. I think the Speaker owes us all answers.
When we come back, one of those Republicans on that panel, Representative Deanne Mazzochi, joins us with a look at what lies ahead. We're back in a moment.
The tax hike amendment on the November ballot would increase taxes on thousands of family farmers and give politicians new powers to increase taxes on every other group of taxpayers with no limits. Please join Illinois farmers and vote no. Thank you.
Bad sleep.
No, the worst.
You know, there's really no excuse for bad sleep. During the extended Labor Day sale at Denver Mattress. Right now, the more you buy, the more you save. Save $100 on every $1,000 you spend. Or to celebrate our newest arrival, come in and test out the outrageously comfortable Casper mattress. Check out the Summit Queen, only $189.99. Plus 5 years, no interest, and free shipping. Hurry, the extended Labor Day sale at Denver Mattress ends soon.
Hustling and Abbott, Illinois' largest bankruptcy-only law firm. Voted 2019's leading lawyer in bankruptcy and foreclosure defense. Just named a top 3 bankruptcy attorney. Call now for a free consultation. Hustling and Abbott, Illinois' largest bankruptcy-only law firm, announces Zoom virtual intaking. It's your choice. Meet with our attorneys face-to-face or on a Zoom virtual office visit. Contact us at bcyhelp.com.
Dogtown Heating, Air, and Plumbing, your home's best friend, encourages everyone that is open for business to submit your company's video today. Here's where to upload yours.
If you're open for business, add your video on WCIA.com.
The perfect gift comes from out of the blue. Looking for something unique for a special gift or a treat for yourself? You are sure to find it at Out of the Blue in Monticello. Polish pottery is both beautiful and functional. Each piece is hand-painted and safe for use in the oven, dishwasher, and microwave. Perfect for baking and serving. Each pattern is unique and beautiful. From bakeware to home decor, we have it all. Visit us at 223 East Livingston Street in Monticello or online at outofthebluepottery.com.
FanDuel Sportsbook makes it easy to bet live during the game. But to make it even easier, we got Hall of Famer Orlando Pace to place Kyle's bet for him.
And it's good.
FanDuel Sportsbook. Get a risk-free first bet.
If the tax hike amendment is passed, it will absolutely negatively affect other Illinois residents. It is just a matter of time before it affects all of us. There's already an issue with people leaving Illinois, and this is going to make it so much worse.
Welcome back. We turn now to one of the House Republicans who sits on that Special Investigative Committee, one of only 3 Republicans in that position. That's Representative Deanne Mazzochi, who joins us from her district offices there. Representative, good to have you with us.
Hi, Mark. Thanks so much for having me.
You seemed a little bit unhappy with the way that first committee hearing ended, kind of quickly, I suppose. Were you unsatisfied with the result of that first meeting?
Well, you know, I think that the committee members recognize that there is an incredible amount of work that we want to make sure we can get done and get it done in a timely fashion. So first of all, the fact that no follow-up meeting was scheduled, we certainly don't want to see any stonewalling on the meeting schedule. The fact that there are a whole host of issues that we're going to need to start addressing. Witnesses we're going to need to hear from, documents we're going to want to consider to review. And, you know, furthermore, we also need to, I think, give Speaker Madigan an opportunity to present at least his opening view of the case. So, you know, there's a whole bunch of just basic scheduling things that need to get done and decided. And I was surprised that Chairman Welch decided he didn't want to talk about those today.
Chairman Welch, when this was first presented to him, he said in an interview on this program he wasn't quite sure what precise charges the Republicans were bringing, that he saw at the time just sort of an empty complaint or a vague complaint. I'm paraphrasing him here. But then again on Thursday, during the hearing, we heard Representative Manley say, crimes? What crimes? That was her quote there. It seems that there's still some appetite from some House Democrats to, if not play the role of advocate or defense attorney for Speaker Madigan, at least raise the question, like, what is the exact crime that Speaker Madigan precisely did? Are you prepared to say that right now? What exactly did Speaker Madigan do?
Right. Well, I think that what, again, what we need to think about is that there's criminal proceedings, which are currently, associated with the U.S. Attorney's Office. There are civil proceedings that are also going forward in federal court. What this committee is designed to do is to be a special investigating committee of a member of the House. The House member happens to be Speaker Mike Madigan, but this is something that the rules contemplate for. In fact, this is Madigan's own rules, and this was the procedure that that he set out forth in them. And it really has to do with maintaining the integrity of the House. So one way in which I might try to analogize it is that you may have an employee who's accused by the feds of bribery. And when it comes to what do you do as a corporation, well, this starts to become, at the very least, not only do you cooperate with the feds, but you have your own HR matter, right, that you need to actually flesh out and figure out because you need to decide, do I keep this employee around or not? Well, we're in a similar type of situation when it comes to Speaker Madigan. The issue is did he, if you follow the language that's actually in the charge that was entered into the record today, it relates to did he actually engage in conduct that is unbecoming of a legislator? Conduct unbecoming of a legislator doesn't have to rise to the level of have you been fully convicted by the U.S. Attorney's Office or have you been formally charged by the U.S. Attorney's Office? But I think that if you look at what some other Democrats who are not on the committee have reiterated, is that what the ComEd Deferred Prosecution Agreement demonstrates is that at the very least, ComEd admits they engaged in illegal behavior with regard to Speaker Madigan. And Speaker Madigan, if he's going to come forward and actually dispute anything that went on with ComEd, we would certainly like to know that sooner rather than later. If he admits that this is what happened with ComEd, then the question becomes, okay, if those facts are not going to be disputed by the Speaker, then that still demonstrates a very concerning pattern in practice. And then the question becomes, does he have any explanation for why that is not conduct unbecoming a legislator, certainly the Speaker of the House?
Well, so to be clear, the Speaker has addressed the core charge that is at least heavily implied in this, which is that he directly engaged. In fact, the charge that Leader Durkin brought in that petition said that Speaker Madigan engaged in conduct. The rest of it is, frankly, immaterial if you can't prove that first part. Did the Speaker personally get engaged in that? And from what everyone has seen so far in federal charging documents, now again, we don't know what might be on wiretaps or what other evidence they might have, but from what we've seen in court documents, even in ComEd's own confession, they only say that they approached members of his inner circle, that they attempted and succeeded at putting them on the payroll, and that they attempted and succeeded in getting legislation that helped their bottom line. But never in their confession do they say, oh yeah, we were in the room with Speaker Madigan, he signed off on this, he engaged in it. How do you get there?
Well, there's a reason why the committee wants to do some work. And I would also note, though, that one of the parts that you're missing is that the parts after the Speaker Madigan engaged, there's a whole bunch of different things that are listed in there, which includes conspiracy, which includes extortion, which includes bribery, which includes a whole pattern and practice of behavior that's at issue. And the ultimate question then becomes is this the type of thing that we think legislators should be associated with? If we're going to say that we are an Illinois House that has integrity, that acts in the best interest of the public, as opposed to a group of connected political insiders who are, operating at the direction of the Speaker, or I think it's going to be very interesting if Speaker Mike Madigan, who certainly has a reputation for not only being about as close to omniscient as you can be when it comes to Springfield, but to suggest that he didn't really know what was going on with his inner circle. I mean, if that's going to be the position that he wants to take before the committee, we're certainly happy to hear from him on it. But, to date, I can't speculate as to where Speaker Madigan is going to say either this is correct or this is wrong. And I don't want to prejudge what's actually going to come out as evidence. But what I do know that we do have is admitted facts. Our statements in the deferred prosecution agreement, and they're pretty bad.
Right. It seems that what you just did, though, was you in a roundabout way put the burden of proof on Speaker Madigan to prove his innocence, and that's not how it works in a court of law, right? That's not the system that we have.
Well, here we already have a whole host of evidence that to date is admitted. If the Speaker wishes to contest that, that was one of the issues that I brought up today, then please do come forward with, the evidence that you have to say that that is wrong, because you already have someone admitting, and again, not just, this is a pretty significant admission. This is a publicly traded corporation, with compliance officers and everything else, saying in federal court, we admit we did this, and they're going to be paying, hundreds of millions of dollars in fines as a consequence. So this is not just some, rumored situation. And then when you look at the nature of the charges, that these things were all being done in connection with, it's appropriate, I think, to consider the fact that these were all being done with the speaker's knowledge, with the speaker's agreement. But if the speaker, again, is going to come forward and say, I had no clue what my close inner circle was doing, then, again, we would like to hear that. And we certainly think that he has the right to come forward and, give his side of the story. All right,
Representative Mazzochi, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
We're back in a minute with Toi Hutchinson, Governor Pritzker's advisor when it comes to all things cannabis. Stick around.
How's your checking account looking? Half full? Half empty? Low? It happens. Then payday rolls around and you're good. So why do banks charge a monthly fee if you don't keep a big minimum balance in your checking? With SafeQ checking, there's no minimum balance, no monthly fee. So you only get the things you want. SafeQ, not a bank. Better.
Your internet and wireless should always have you covered. And with Xfinity, you're covered far and wide. Like with the best internet experience, wall-to-wall at home with Xfinity X5. And with the best wireless coverage, coast to coast with Xfinity Mobile. And the savings? We've got you covered there too. Save up to $400 a year on your wireless bill. Now that's simple, easy, awesome.
So get Xfinity Internet. Plus, switch to Xfinity Mobile. And with our limited time sale, get $400 off an eligible Samsung 5G phone. Click, call, or visit a store today.
For safe and effective cleaning, start with IonoPure, the world's most powerful line of non-toxic cleaners, sanitizers, and disinfectants. Most of the cleaning products you use every day are not only toxic, but many times people don't use them correctly. They could be ineffective, causing harmful bacteria to thrive and spread. All IonoPure products are completely safe to use in any situation. Safe around children, pets, plants, and food. Harmful bacteria doesn't stand a chance with our powerful cleaners. At Ionogen, our team of doctors, engineers, and scientists developed IonoPure to be safe for everyone.
No matter the job, Ionogen has the solution from home to hospital. Protect your family, customers, and staff today.
For safe and effective cleaning, start with IonoPure. Let the world's most powerful line of non-toxic cleaners, sanitizers, and disinfectants start working for you. Find us at ionopure.com or at your local authorized distributor and see how you can Ionogize with IonoPure.
Give your home the update it deserves today at Menards. Mastercraft makes great doors inside and out. Choose from our great selection of doors in stock. Right now, get 11% off all Mastercraft doors. Add security and style to your door with durable hardware from Schlage. Protect your home with a variety of designs and finishes and get 11% off all Schlage products. Start saving with 11% off everything now at Menards.
Save big money at Menards.
Joining us now from the government offices in Chicago is former state senator Toi Hutchinson, who now serves as Governor Pritzker's senior advisor on cannabis-related issues. It's good to have you with us.
Hi, thanks for being here.
Can you address, first of all, just this criticism from some leaders we've seen? Perhaps you've seen even the remarks from one of your former colleagues. I think you served with him for a short time, former Senator Ricky Hendon, who said that this process made a lot of big promises, but in his words, it turned out to be, quote, oppressive and rigged against some of the communities of colors that he's served. Can you respond to his comments?
You know, when we rolled this out, we said we wanted to make sure that one of the things that we were going to do was change the face of the industry. We wanted more participation from a wider group, a diverse group. So we targeted the people who were most impacted by the war on drugs. And we did it in 3 ways. One was, how do you change the face of the industry? The second pillar was, what do you do with the money? And the third pillar was, how do you undo those harms? And in 9 months, we have expunged over 10,000 records. The sales from this plant are being directed towards communities that have been most impacted by the war on drugs. And we just had our first licensure round, which produced a applicant pool that was more diverse than anybody's ever seen in the country. So right now, one of the things that we focus on, and we have to focus on, is that because there's really no trail to follow, there's no other state that's tried to do it this way. Going through this process is going to unearth things that we thought we knew in the beginning and things that we have to fix as we move forward. So I think the most important part of the law, which is different than most that we've seen so far, is that a pause is built in. After that first round that we do, it is, did it work as it was intended? What are the things we can do to get more specific about targeting the population we wanted so that we can continue on every successive round to keep getting better? So right now we see an applicant pool that's going into the process that's 62% people of color. Again, something that's never happened anywhere else in the country. What we have to work on, though, is expanding that pool so that more and more people can have a chance to participate in this. So these are lessons that we have to look at with literally a surgical approach, because undoing 80 years of failed drug policy and systemic and structural things that keep people from participating in licensure process in almost any industry are not going to be undone by the first bill in the first round. So we're committed. We've always been committed.
Yeah, you mentioned correcting, who goes to jail, but also this portion about who gets the licenses is about who gets paid, and that's the question. What was it a mistake to allow the same company to basically buy out, stack the deck with a lot of their applications? Was it a mistake to allow the same company to buy multiple applications at once?
Yeah, the first change that we have to fix is the amount of applications you can put in at one time. We looked at that on the license cap side, that you can't have any more than 10. And that was done so that people coming into the industry would be able to compete, at least build up to scale as to what the original operators are going to have right now. So we didn't want to cement in the fact that the original operators would only be the ones that had 10 licenses. So we thought about it on that side. We missed, how many applications you can put in at one time, and that resulted in an applicant pool that was huge. I think the good part of the fact that the application pool was as huge as it was just that the makeup of it, 97% of all those applications came in qualifying as social equity applicants. And again, there's no example of how the best way to do this is, because it doesn't exist anywhere else. So this is sort of like learning to fly a plane while you're flying it. And we always knew that it was going to be a marathon, not a sprint.
Why set a cap on the number of applications at all? There was an article in Crane's Chicago Business that raises this point and says a better approach would be to remove the cap on licenses while adopting a set of reasonable licensing standards meant to ensure the solvency and integrity of the industry. Anybody who meets those standards should get a license. That was the argument in Crane's. I suppose to ask the question a different way, if there's this much interest, this many business owners, entrepreneurs who want in on the market, they think they can do it, why keep them out?
One of the most important things we have to do is one of the things that we've seen that happened in every other state. When you let out hundreds and hundreds of licenses at one time, the industry is what we see. It's an all-white male, very wealthy owned industry. That's what we see everywhere. So the first answer to that is, if we do what everybody else did, we're going to get what everybody else got. And because the intention in this was to change, was to diversify the kinds of people who could have a chance to come into this, we have to prove that this works first. And so we were charged with balancing something, like creating a process that would expand the number of people who'd be able to participate, and then figuring out whether or not those things that we did were what we needed to do to accomplish that before we let out the rest of these licenses. This first round was always going to be the round that was going to teach more than anything else could teach about how to do that. And ironically, because of what we've seen and the fact that there's only 21 entities in this thing, and that we were all shocked by the few number of entities, even though they represent a large group of applications, that is something that has to be fixed before we let out anything else. Like that is a lesson that is right here. So if we take that logic in order to grow it to the point where the state can have 500 licenses. That's what the cap is in the statute. We still have to get the kinks out of this process first. So we can't go forward until we know exactly all the pieces, the things that worked, the things that didn't work, so that every successive round grows an industry that looks different than anywhere else in the country.
Those investors with deep pockets know that one immutable truth, I suppose, is that cash is king, and that if they could sort of stack the odds in their favor, of course, why not, if you have that disposable income or that available capital. But there are those other entrepreneurs, and I wonder if maybe you've encountered some of them or perhaps seen some of their complaints, who didn't have all that much to start with. They were really hoping for a chance to get in here. Some of them even invested in hiring advisors or outside counselors, people to help bring them in to build their applications. And now they're looking at this big expense. They've invested all this money, and for what? And I wonder, how does the state work with people in that situation who've emptied their pockets, trying to get in on this industry, and so far have nothing to show for it? What do you say to those people?
We knew that first let's say this, that growing an industry from scratch in the state is one of the most difficult things to do. And we knew that there was going to be a lot of disappointment because there were only 75 licenses we were giving. So when you have an application pool that's 4,518 applications for 75 licenses, I think everybody going in knew that there was a much stronger chance that they weren't going to get the license than that they would. Moving forward, I'm really hopeful because they're a part of this process. They are actually teaching us. And it's a good thing that people are speaking out and saying this is the way it was for us, so that we can then, again, take that information so that we can do this better next time.
Thank you for joining us for a look behind the curtain at this competitive market.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too. All right, and we're back in just a moment.
Inman Place in downtown Champaign is now hosting in-person tours. Inman Place offers beautiful apartments, furnished and unfurnished, and a move-in special that can't be beat. Inman Place, voted best senior independent living in Champaign. Schedule your in-person tour today.
Ready to sell your home in 2020? With a guaranteed offer from Ryan Dallas Real Estate, skip the process of listing your home and go straight to sold, closing in as little as 3 weeks. Stay hassle-free with Ryan Dallas Real Estate's guaranteed offer. It's selling made simple.
If you have an electrical, plumbing, or heating and cooling problem, there's only one home service company you need. When you want 100% satisfaction and the finest service, make things easy. Call Edelman. Edelman Inc. is a proud sponsor of the Viewers Club.
At Osling & Associates, we handle bankruptcy and only bankruptcy. When you need help, call Osling & Associates. There's only a $750 fee for single filing Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Bankruptcy questions? Visit our website at bcyhelp.com. An emergency bankruptcy can stop foreclosures, judgments, repossessions, utility shutoffs, and court proceedings. Call Osling & Associates with 20 Illinois offices to serve you. Call Osling & Associates now and stop the collection calls.
This year, the Alzheimer's Association Walk to End Alzheimer's is everywhere. On every sidewalk, track, and trail across this country. All of us are raising funds for one goal: a world without Alzheimer's and all other dementia. Because this disease isn't waiting, neither are you. Take the first step on your walk right now. Go to alz.org/walk.
Inman Place in downtown Champaign is now hosting in-person tours. Inman Place offers beautiful apartments, furnished and unfurnished, and a move-in special that can't be beat. Inman Place, voted best senior independent living in Champaign. Schedule your in-person tour today.
That does it for us this week. Thank you for joining us. We hope you'll be right back here at the same time next Sunday. For Capital Connection, I'm Mark Maxwell. Stay connected to the Capitol all week. Follow us on Twitter at CapConnectIL or watch reports from our Capitol team on WCIA3. You can also find us on Facebook or WCIA.com.